Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
The other day, I saw a wedding, but wait, I want to tell you about a Christmas tree instead. The wedding was beautiful. I liked it very much. But what happened with the Christmas tree was even better. I don't know why, but seeing the wedding made me think of the Christmas tree. This is what happened. 5 years ago, on New Year's Eve, I was invited to a children's party by a man who was very important in the business world. He had many friends and many people knew him. It seemed like the children's party was really an excuse for the parents to talk to each other about things that were important to them, in a casual way. I was not part of the group, and since I had nothing special to talk about, I spent the evening on my own. There was another man there who, like me, had just come to this happy family event by chance. He was the first person I noticed. He didn't look like someone from a rich or important family. He was tall, a little thin, very serious, and dressed nicely. It looked like he didn't really enjoy the family party. The moment he went to sit in a corner by himself, the smile disappeared from his face, and he looked very serious with his dark eyebrows close together. He only knew the host and seemed very bored, even though he tried hard to look like he was having fun. Later, I found out that he was from a small town and came to the city for some difficult, important work. He brought a letter to our host, and the host was taking care of him, but not with much interest. He invited him to the children's party just to be polite. Nobody played cards with him, and they didn't offer him cigars. Nobody talked to him. Maybe they could tell what kind of person he was just by looking at him. So the man, not knowing what to do with his hands, spent the evening stroking his whiskers. His whiskers were really nice, but he touched them so much that it felt like his whiskers were more important than him. There was another guest who caught my attention, but he was very different. He was very important. His name was Julian Mastakovich. You could tell right away that he was a special guest. The host and hostess were very nice to him, giving him wine and introducing him to other guests, but they didn't take him to meet anyone he didn't want to meet. I saw our host's eyes fill with tears when Julian Mastakovich said he had never had such a nice evening before. Somehow, being near this important man made me feel uncomfortable. So, after playing with the children, 5 of them were the host's well-fed kids. I went into a small room with plants. It took up almost half the space. The children were lovely. They didn't act like the adults at all, even though the mothers and nannies tried to make them behave. In a short time, they took all the sweets from the Christmas tree and had already broken half of their toys before they even knew which toys belonged to them. One boy, who was very handsome with dark eyes and curly hair, kept pointing his wooden toy gun at me. But the child who got the most attention was his sister, a girl around 11 years old. She was as beautiful as a little angel. She was quiet and thoughtful with big, dreamy eyes. The other children had somehow upset her, and she left them. She came into the same room I was in and sat in a corner with her doll. Her father is a very rich businessman. The guests whispered to each other, looking amazed. He has already saved 300,000 rubles for her dowry. When I turned to look at the group talking about this, my eyes met Julian Mastakovich's. He was standing there, listening closely to their boring talk, with his hands behind his back and his head tilted to one side. At the same time, I was very impressed by how smart our host was in giving out the gifts. The little girl with the rich dowry got the best doll, and the other gifts were given according to how important the parents were. The last child, a small boy of 10, with red hair and freckles, got a little book about nature, without pictures or any decorations. He was the governess's child. His mother was a poor widow, and her little boy, wearing an old jacket, looked very sad and shy. He took the nature book and walked slowly around, looking at the other children's toys. He really wanted to play with them, but he was too afraid to try. You could tell he already knew he was not as important as the others. I like watching children. It's interesting to see how each child tries to show who they are. I could see that the other children's toys were very exciting to the red-haired boy, especially the toy theater. He wanted to play with it so much that he decided to be extra nice to the other children. He smiled and started to play with them. He even gave his only apple to a boy whose pockets were already full of sweets, and he carried another child on his back. All because he wanted to stay and play with the toy theater. But after a short time, one rude boy hit him. The red-haired boy didn't even cry. His mother, the governess, came over and told him to stop bothering the other children. So he quietly went to the same room where the little girl and I were sitting. She let him sit beside her, and they both started to play with her fancy doll. Almost half an hour went by, and I was almost falling asleep while sitting there, half listening to the red-haired boy and the rich girl, when suddenly Julian Mastakovich came into the room. He had slipped out of the main room while the children were making a lot of noise. I had noticed earlier that he had been talking to the rich girl's father, whom he had just met. He stood there for a moment, thinking and whispering to himself, as if he were counting something on his fingers. 300, 311, 12, 13, 16. In 5 years, let's say 4%, 5 times 12, 60, and from these 60, let's say in 5 years it will be maybe 400. But that clever old man probably gets 8 or even 10%. Let's suppose it will be 500, 500,000 at least. And anything extra will be pocket money. He blew his nose and was about to leave the room when he saw the little girl and stopped. From behind the plants, he didn't see me. He looked very excited, maybe because of all his calculations. He rubbed his hands, moved around, and seemed to get more and more excited. But after a while, he calmed down and stopped moving. He looked at the girl and was about to go to her, but first he looked around the room. Then, as if he felt guilty, he quietly walked over to the child, smiling, and bent down to kiss her on the head. His arrival was so sudden that the girl let out a small scream. "What are you doing here, dear child?" he whispered, looking around and gently pinching her cheek. "We're playing," she said. "What, with him?" said Julian Mastakovich, giving the governess's child a mean look. "You should go back to the other room, my boy," he said to him. The boy didn't say anything and looked up at the man with big, wide eyes. Julian Mastakovich looked around again, carefully, and bent down over the girl. "What do you have there? A doll, my dear?" "Yes, sir," the little girl said, feeling a bit scared. Her face looked worried. "A doll? Do you know what dolls are made of, my dear? No, sir, she said quietly, and looked down at the floor. They are made of cloth, my dear. You, boy, go back to the other room where the other children are, Julian Mastakovich said, looking at the boy with a strict face. Both children frowned. They held each other's hands and didn't want to let go. And do you know why they gave you the doll? Julian Mastakovich asked, lowering his voice. No, she said, because you were a good, very good girl all week. After saying that, Julian Mastakovich looked like he was very nervous. He looked around again and then said in a very quiet voice, almost shaking with excitement, If I come to visit your parents, will you love me, my dear? He tried to kiss the little girl, but the red-haired boy saw she was about to cry. So he grabbed her hand and started to cry too. That made Julian Mastakovich very angry. Go away, go away, go back to the other children, he shouted. I don't want him to go. I don't want him to. The girl cried. You go away. Leave him alone. Leave him alone. She was almost crying now. Just then, there was the sound of footsteps at the door. Julian Mastakovich stood up straight quickly. The red-haired boy was very scared. He let go of the girl's hand and quickly ran along the wall to the other room, escaping to the dining room. Julian Mastakovich, not wanting to be noticed, also went to the dining room. His face was as red as a lobster. When he saw himself in the mirror, he looked embarrassed. It seemed like he was mad at himself for being so excited and impatient. Even though he was an important man, his plans for the future had made him act like a greedy boy, going straight for what he wanted, even though it wouldn't be something he could have for 5 more years. I followed him into the dining room, where I saw something surprising. Julian Mastakovich, still red with anger, with an angry look in his eyes, started to scare the red-haired boy. The boy kept stepping back, farther and farther, until there was nowhere else to go, and he didn't know what to do because he was so frightened. Get out of here! What are you doing? Stealing fruit, are you? Go away, you freckle-faced boy! Julian Mastakovich shouted. The scared boy, with no other choice, quickly crawled under the table. Julian, now very angry, used his handkerchief like a whip to try and force the boy out. Julian Mastakovich was a large man, heavy and red-faced. He got so mad at the boy that he started acting like a crazy person. I couldn't help but laugh. Julian turned around, confused, and forgot for a moment how important he was. Just then, our host came in. The boy crawled out from under the table and wiped his clothes. Julian quickly brought his handkerchief to his nose, trying to act normal. The host looked at all of us with some suspicion, but he quickly used the moment to talk to Julian. This is the boy I told you about, the host said, pointing to the red-haired boy. I was hoping you could help him. Oh, Julian Mastakovich replied, still not fully calm. He's my governess's son, the host continued. She's a poor widow. If you could help. Impossible, Julian said quickly. I'm sorry, but there are no openings, and there are others waiting before him. Too bad, said the host. He's a good, quiet boy. A naughty little rascal, I'd say, Julian replied, frowning. Go away, boy. Go back to the other children. Julian glanced at me, and I couldn't hold back my laughter. He turned to our host and whispered, asking who I was. They both left the room, ignoring me. I was still laughing as I followed them to the drawing room. There, Julian Mastakovich was already talking to a lady who was holding the rich little girl's hand. Julian praised the girl, saying how beautiful, smart, and well-behaved she was. The girl's mother looked so happy, almost crying, while the father smiled proudly. Everyone shared in the happiness. Even the children stopped playing so they wouldn't disturb the conversation. The girl's mother asked Julian if he would visit them, and he happily agreed. The guests then spread around the room, talking about how wonderful the businessman, his wife, and his daughter were, but most of all Julian Mastakovich. Is he married? I asked someone standing next to me, looking at Julian. Julian Mastakovich gave me a very angry look. No, answered my friend, shocked by my question. A while ago, I passed by a church. There were many people gathered for a wedding. It was a gloomy day, and it had started to rain. I went inside to see the wedding. The groom was a small, round man, dressed very well. He looked busy, giving orders and fixing things. Soon, people said the bride was coming. I pushed through the crowd to see her. The bride was very beautiful, but she looked sad. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked like she had been crying. She was only 16 years old. Her beauty had a serious, almost sad look, but she also seemed very innocent, like a child. Then I looked at the groom again. Suddenly, I realized it was Julian Mastakovich. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. I quickly left the church. As I walked out, I heard people talking about how rich the bride was. They said she had a dowry of 500,000 rubles. His calculations were right, I thought as I walked away.